Good morning. I think everybody knows me, but if you don't know me, I'm Daniel. Who's every Friday. It's usually just a quick 15 minutes, not designed to be a long-winded thing, just some quick updates on rates and some little tidbits. And then for this month, we've been talking about appraisals on a number of different levels, primarily the changes that are coming down the pipeline in November. And on Wednesday of this week, I had Chris Henderson, for many years, great appraiser. He came to the Southside office and did a Q&A, talked about some of those changes and some other general stuff. So I took it upon myself to give you a very quick 5 to 10 minute summarization of how that hour-long conversation went, just so that everybody is getting to know here. So that's primarily what we'll talk about here. As normal, just quick interest rate update here to start the week. And we like when the chart looks like this. So interest rates actually have gotten a little bit better this week. They've come back down to 2-week lows, moving in the right direction. I think a lot of that is really just some of the developments overseas in Iran. There's a 60-day ceasefire now, which a little bit of stabilization there is helping with interest rates. War headlines continue to move things with potential peace deals, the ceasefire in place. But all that stuff is good to help normalize what's going on in the markets. Hopefully we can see a slow trickle down in rates as that comes to an end. But we also got some good news on inflations. The Federal Reserve uses a inflation measure called personal consumption expenditures, or PCE. That's their preferred measure of inflation. And the data that came out this week, the core PCE number, which basically takes out things like oil prices, which monetary policy doesn't have a huge impact on oil prices. So that's why they stripped that out of their core number. And anyway, that came a little bit better than expected. So a little bit of a tailwind for interest rates with PCE coming in a little bit lower than expected, as much as the war headlines have dictated a lot of what rates are doing. Some of those other data points obviously still matter. And as the war hopefully comes to a close, those data points will continue to drive exactly where rates are. So we'll take a win here this week, and we'll hope that continues. And then quick, did you know, last week I talked about something a little bit different with VA appraisals, but I wanted to make mention of this because it's actually a question we get a lot. So historically, if you have a VA loan, let's say you have a single family home, but then there's a detached structure, it could be a shed. And that shed has, let's say it's a very nice shed, but it has some issues, right? There's wood rot, or the roof's got an issue. Historically, if the appraiser was going to contribute, if it's going to provide value to that structure in the appraisal, they had to inspect that ancillary structure to make sure that it met the same minimum property requirements that are required of the main home. So significant wood rot would be an issue. A roof that had an issue would be a problem. But they basically recently have changed that, where essentially appraisers are no longer required to inspect other dwelling structures to make sure they meet minimum property requirements. So we get that question a lot. Hey, there's a house, but there's a shed that's in rough shape. Does the seller need to repair this too? And the historical answer has always been, if it's being given value by the appraiser, then yes. But the way that I would interpret this moving forward is basically, if you have a VA loan that you're doing on a property, whether you're a listing agent or a selling agent, if you have a dwelling structure that maybe needs a little TLC, you don't necessarily need to have a WDO inspection done on that anymore, because the appraiser is not looking for minimum property requirements. So if the appraiser is not looking for it, then WDO inspector doesn't need to do it either. So you would just need that WDO inspection on the main home. So that's really, I think, my biggest takeaway from that. Obviously now the appraiser can give value to that additional structure as well, so there's benefit there as well. But a welcome change, kind of one of those things. The VA sends out a circular, which is an announcement per se, but that information a lot of times doesn't make it out very quickly. So one of those things that snuck under the radar, but when I read that, I thought worth bringing up because we get that question a lot. And then a quick little success story. I just wanted to give you guys a little tidbit of information. We had a customer reach out this week, try to do a down payment assistance loan, been turned down by a couple of lenders, and both for different reasons, ironically. But essentially, we're able to find a solution here because when a lot of people, when they think about down assistance, they think specifically of bond loans. The reason they're called bond loans is because the money for the down payment assistance is issued through government bonds. And those bond loans require that you count all household income towards the income limits for the program. So if you have a husband and wife and it's just one of them on the loan, the other is not, if combined they make too much money, then they don't qualify for the bond program. But there are other programs that offer down payment assistance that only require us to count application income. So same scenario, maybe you've got a husband and wife, and one of them makes enough money to qualify, but with both incomes, they would be over the income for bond. You can flip them to one of the other programs, just use the income for the person that you need on the loan and move on down the road. So if you ever have down payment assistance programs that you're looking at for a customer or got a customer that's applied for them, just know there's really probably 7 or 8 or 9 different iterations of down payment assistance programs. So if you find yourself hitting a wall trying to go one direction, might be worth pivoting and trying to go another direction and see if there maybe is a different program that they could utilize and still get down payment assistance. So big takeaway there. There are lots of different ways to do down payment assistance. And then lastly, I really just want to spend time on this UAD 3.6. What does that mean? So UAD, Uniform Appraisal Data Set. That basically means that there are new appraisal forms that are coming to all loan types. So conventional loans, FHA, VA, and USDA loans moving forward, effective November 2nd. All of those loans, they're transitioning to new appraisal forms that are a good bit different than the forms that have been used for the last 20 years. And just to explain why they're making the change. The short answer is the agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, basically been trying to streamline appraisals for a while now. They've done that through creating systems where appraisals are run through and scored so that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac can collect that data. They've done that through offering appraisal waivers and hybrid appraisals and things to streamline the appraisal process in general. But this is basically a move towards being able to quickly have AI run appraisals through a system, interpret them, score them, and have less underwriter involvement at a human level looking at appraisals, which hopefully then means less issues with appraisals in general by streamlining these forms. So why they're doing that change, they want a more consistent appraisal. They want a little bit less subjectivity, and they want it to be laid out in a way where an AI model can run it through a system and get all the information they need without as many human eyes looking at appraisals. And Chris talked about this a good bit at length, but in terms of what that really means for you guys, the biggest takeaway I had with talking with Chris was right now, he used an example. He had an appraisal that was over basically 3 houses away from the Buckman Bridge on the water. And obviously 3 houses away from the Buckman Bridge, there's a lot of bridge traffic, right? So when he did the appraisal, he said there's not one sale that would be comparable to that sale in the last 12 months, meaning that it's on the water and it's in close proximity to a major bridge. The example was, hey, if I'm doing this appraisal, there's going to have to be a lot of adjustments. There's going to have to be a lot of explanation. I'm going to have to go farther back in time to find comps, and there's going to be a lot more discretion involved in that appraisal. When we move to these new forms, basically the way that they're laid out, each comparable sale, you put it in there, you have to very clearly and mathematically and precisely explain why you made certain adjustments on an appraisal, as opposed to being able to take more discretion based on the appraiser's opinion, right? So I think that the first takeaway is appraisals might lose some subjectivity from that, and you might have to see a much more calculated approach to how an appraiser is making adjustments based on certain characteristics, square footage, location, all of the things that they would normally be making adjustments on. But that was one of my big takeaways. Right now, you look at an appraisal and you might see that an appraiser wrote 3 or 4 paragraphs on an addendum explaining exactly what their logic was. I think moving forward, I'm not going to be able to maybe take some of those same liberties to be able to expand upon things and put their own opinion behind it. It's going to be much more calculated and mathematical, I think. And then the second big takeaway was there's going to be a lot more granular property data that appraisers have to collect. So when an appraiser does an appraisal now, there's a bunch of additional data sets that they have to input. They have to know how old the roof is, how old the AC is. They have to know what type of floor is in the home and also when it was installed. Those are just a few examples, but there's a lot more input that's required from the appraiser so that all of the components of the property itself are accurately depicted in that appraisal. Whereas as it stands right now, an appraiser is not necessarily saying, hey, how old is the air conditioning? It's just a matter of, did it work when they were there, right? That's not to say that they're turning this into a home inspection, but appraisers are going to have to also pull permits in some scenarios to corroborate, is the roof indeed 12 years old? So my big takeaway from that and what Chris mentioned was the more accurate the seller's property disclosure is, the faster that the appraiser can collect that information and accurately depict that in the appraisal. That was my biggest takeaway there. And then I'll skip ahead to the fourth bullet point there. My other big takeaway was I think that the listing agent being present while the appraisal is happening is probably going to be of value to be able to make sure that appraisals can get turned around faster. Because if the appraiser has questions about some of those specific property data metrics they have to put in there, having the ability to ask questions to the listing agent or say, hey, I'll need X, Y, and Z from you to complete this appraisal. I think that it would be of great value instead of appraiser having to email for information and then wait for a response. I think that really was my big takeaways. It's probably something that should be standard practice for a listing agent to be present at an appraisal for. And then something I mentioned last week, which Chris reiterated, appraisals will take significantly longer, probably in some cases twice as long as it takes them to do an appraisal right now. And unfortunately, that also probably means that the cost of an appraisal is going to go up in correspondence with the additional time that's going to be required. So anytime that something new is rolled out, there's a learning curve. So I think that over time, the amount of additional time spent by appraisers will probably come down. But in the short term, I think you can expect new system, new forms. Appraisals are going to take longer and likely will be more costly. Ordering appraisals sooner in the loan process as opposed to later, probably going to be extremely helpful for lenders when this rollout happens in November to make sure there aren't delays with closings. And that was really my big takeaways from that, the things that I thought were maybe most impactful. So I think there's a couple questions in the chat here. Let me grab it real quick. So, so November 2nd is when the changes take effect. And like anything, these things are always fluid. So that's not to say that the timeline doesn't change, but to this point, we're basically in June and there's been no talk of a delay in rollout. So it's something that it seems like is still trending towards November 2nd. And then Trish, as far as your question goes, I guess maybe you want to give me some more context on what you're referring to there, property condition.
Yeah, because there are, like in Oak Harbor, for example, we're in a very heavy, there are over 300 homes here, and they're all concrete block, most of them built in the 60s. And you have one that on paper is a comp, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,200 square feet, but one of them's renovated, the other one isn't. There's a $100,000 difference in the price point. But how is that going to be affected by what you're describing if this is all going to be AI generated?
I think that it's not all, it's still an appraiser doing an appraisal. So it's really moving towards being able to have less human eyes on an appraisal once it's completed. So right now, when an appraisal is done, it gets sent through a system. It gets scored, actually. A lot of appraisers don't even know that, but there's a risk score assigned to an appraisal, which is still going to happen. I think the goal is that the agencies, they want less subjectivity and they want the data in a more concise format where a computer can pick it up and read it. But I think at the end of the day, the comps that are being used are still the same comps that are going to be used on a new appraisal. It might just be a matter of a little more attention to detail on if it was built in the 60s, how recently was the roof replaced and the AC and the upgrades that were done, more detail around when they were done, what type of upgrades. I think having all of that information for the appraiser via the property disclosure or an upgrade list, my takeaway was I think that is going to significantly save appraisers time so they're not having to track down what type of floor is this and is it wood, is it vinyl, when was it put in? So I think that just more detail upfront from the sellers, which you realize obviously a lot of times sellers don't know exactly when some of these things were done or what the make and model of these things were. But the more of that information that they collect up front, the smoother it's going to be when it comes time to have an appraisal done.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, especially for those homes that are sold off market.
It will certainly be a learning curve. I think that I'm of the mind that anytime a change is announced, there's always this overreaction to one side. And then there's this shift back into the middle of, okay, the change isn't as bad as we thought. Turns out this is a slightly new way of doing things, but the world is not coming to an end. I use the NAR settlements as an example. I think in the lending world, there were a lot of folks talking about how this will change the game and all of these things will change. And yes, some things have changed, but also a lot of things have still stayed the same. So I really present all this to say, I think, what can we do today so that we're not completely caught off guard? There's going to be a subset of agents out there that have absolutely no clue that come November 2nd, appraisals will look different. And they'll have absolutely no clue why an appraisal would cost more or take longer, or why an appraiser would be asking them questions that they historically haven't asked them before. So really just being prepared that you may be asked questions and ask for things that you aren't asked for before, and understanding the why and how it's going to impact the appraisal, and more so the timeline of when closing will happen. That's my biggest takeaway. Yeah. And then I think over the course of 60 to 90 days, people will start to figure out what's needed and how to make this faster. And I'm sure that there will be plenty of ways that appraisers will figure out how to do these things a little more quickly. Chris even mentioned some type of software that you can upload your photos and it'll basically somehow figure out a lot of the answers to these questions. Sure that appraisers will figure out some way to get that information without having to manually go through and input those additional 50, 60 data fields themselves. But I think just knowing that it's happening and being aware that things will be a little bit different is really the biggest way that we can get out in front of this, and then reserve any freakouts until it actually has been implemented.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you for that. And it's always good for the listing agent to be present during the appraisal.
Yeah, you'd be surprised on the thing we talked about when our lender orders an appraisal. We obviously give a purchase contract. We provide the listing agent's contact information because that is who the appraiser's supposed to contact. But beyond that, we don't know when the appraiser is going to call. We don't know when they're going to go out there. We're just told they've accepted it and here's when it's due. So we talked about, hey, property's vacated on lockbox and the appraiser could go out whenever. If you as a listing agent want to be there, maybe once the appraisal's ordered, maybe you should just take it off lockbox so that the appraiser has to contact you and you know when they're going to be there. Yep. And that way they don't sneak in wanting to be there and you're not there.
Yeah, good idea.
That's what I always recommend when somebody says, I really want to be there. Just make it not accessible to the appraiser unless they call you.
Yeah.
But I think the other interesting thing is the agencies are really trying to move towards a model where they can do as many appraisals as possible without having an actual appraiser do it. So can they collect enough data about the property in conjunction with their own internal modeling of what they think homes are worth to basically be able to say, hey, as long as this property is in the shape that we expect it to be, we accept the value of this property without having an appraiser actually do it. So I think that'll be interesting. In a way, it's curious to know, are appraisers being the machine that's ultimately designed to replace them, which that could be many years down the road, right? AI is going to replace us all if you ask the right person. So it's interesting stuff nonetheless. And those were my big takeaways in an hour of him talking. Those were the big things that I thought, hey, these are the things that I would want to know as an agent as we approach November.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Does anybody got any other questions about anything here? I know I just threw a lot of stuff in a very short window.
I have one question, Dalia. It's Heidi here. I wanted to see, will the seller's disclosure form change to meet the new standards?
I haven't heard any rumblings of that. So no, that's a good.
It would just make it so much easier if there's more questions to be asked. They can support the appraisal.
I think that's a really good question. I would be curious. I imagine what probably will happen will be appraisal roll out first. And then if it's an issue that could be resolved by updating the seller disclosure, then probably at some point FAR gets involved to say, how can we revise this form so that it helps the appraiser? So I would imagine it probably would be hey, this is a problem that we could solve. And then somewhere down the road, you get the solution.
All right.
That's great. I didn't even think about that. So you're one step ahead of me. If you guys need anything else, if you need a pre-approving today, tomorrow, the next day, let us know. And we'll come bearing maps next week.
All right. So thanks to Daniel. Bye, everyone.